Glad you could join us today on EdFile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. With the coronavirus pandemic, we can breathe fresher air, but the fear is this may not last long. Scientists are warning that without structural change, the emissions declines caused by coronavirus could be short-lived and have little impact on the concentrations of carbon dioxide that have accumulated in the atmosphere over decades. And humanitarians are also warning that food insecurity is on the rise. Today, we continue our look at how the pandemic is affecting our world and the way out. So stay with us. Carbon dioxide emissions could fall by the largest amount since World War II this year, as the coronavirus outbreak brings economies to a virtual standstill.
And that's the kind of change we may be looking at
Rob
now.
Jackson, who chairs the Global Carbon Project, which produces widely watched annual emissions estimates, said carbon output could fall by more than 5% year on year, the first dip since a 1.4% reduction after the 2008 financial crisis.
When I look at what's happening now, though, transport's about a quarter or more of global carbon dioxide emissions. If the economy stays slow, if transport stays down, we could see a drop in carbon dioxide emissions this year of 5% or more. And that may not sound like that much, but we've never seen that in the past 75 years, maybe going back to the end of World War II, when the economy kind of crashed as everybody came home and we stopped making tanks and airplanes and blowing them up. I mean, only then did GDP really crater. And that's the kind of change we may be looking at now. So nobody who's 75 years old or less has ever seen anything like this.
The prediction among a range of new forecasts being produced by climate researchers represent a tiny sliver of good news in the midst of crisis. Climate scientists had warned world governments that global emissions must start dropping by 2020 to avoid the worst impact of climate change. But the improvements are for all the wrong reasons. Tied to a world-shaking global health emergency that has infected more than 1 million people, while shuttering factories, grounding airlines, and forcing hundreds of millions of people to stay at home to slow the contagion.
We've been measuring CO2 there since about January, and we have about 6 months of data from last year to compare it with as well for the same time period. And it's been quite surprising to see how much of a reduction in CO2 we're seeing. But in CO2, methane, CO, a lot of the stuff we're measuring, I was very surprised at how much has dropped away over the last 2 weeks.
After world greenhouse gas emissions dipped in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, they shot back up a whopping 5.1% in the recovery. The pattern of a shift rebound has already begun to play out in China, where emissions fell by an estimated 25% as the country closed factories and put in place strict measures on people's movement to contain the coronavirus earlier this year, but have since returned to a normal range.
CO2 is not something you can breathe, you can't really tell what it's doing. What I can latch onto is air quality. If my acne goes nuts, if I'm struggling to breathe, things like that, and they're all tied together. So every source of NOx that leads to ozone is a source of CO2 in the city. So cars release NO2, CO, CO2, and they're all closely tied together. So a reduction in improvement in air quality by reducing some of the emissions of the stuff that makes us sick would actually help to reduce the CO2 emissions at the same time. Now, that is kind of one of the co-benefits of having both of those go down at the same time, and it's with proper policies we could really push that forward so that we're improving air quality, people's asthma rates go down when the ozone goes down, and things like that are tangible.
That kind of resilience underscores the magnitude of the economic transformation that will be needed to meet the goals of an international deal brokered in Paris in 2015 to try to avert the most catastrophic climate change scenarios.
So the reduction in traffic has been about, some say 30%, some are saying more, and that's a really large source of both CO2 and of NOx and other pollutants, so the stuff that you can actually see in the atmosphere. This is the cleanest we've seen since we started measuring. And by all accounts, looked at some of the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York, some of their data, it's the cleanest CO that they've got on their records available online. So for the CO, most of the time in New York when we've been measuring, the carbon monoxide levels are 300 ppb and they go up from there. So some of the highest concentrations I've ever seen are around New York. And I've done a lot of measurements in fires, for example. And the highest sustained numbers are in urban areas, in cities. And earlier this week, we were looking at maybe 180 ppb of CO, which to me, background remote atmosphere in the Northern Hemisphere is about 150 ppb. That's what we use for like background numbers. So to see New York go as clean as some places I grew up in is quite surprising. I didn't think I'd ever see that.
A United Nations report published in November found that emissions will have to start falling by an average of 7.6% per year to give the world a viable chance of limiting the rise in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the most ambitious Paris goal. With the world dependent for fossil fuels for 80% of its energy, emissions forecasts are often based on projections for global economic growth.
So there are different policies in different continents, for example. So in the EU, as part of their program to reduce carbon emissions, they encouraged the use, they brought in tax policies that encouraged people to buy diesel vehicles. Now, diesel emits a lot more NO2 for the amount of CO2 burned. So for a gallon of diesel, you can go a lot further, but you also release a lot more NO2. So that's what we heard about with Dieselgate and Volkswagen. The effect of that is you can see from space just how much more NO2 and then ozone there is in Europe, and they have a serious problem with it. So as vehicles stop driving as much in Europe, the effect will be magnified, but it will be very short-lived. NO2 does not have a long lifetime. So as soon as everybody gets back to driving again, the numbers are just going to rocket up.
Last month, the Center for International Climate Research in Oslo predicted carbon emissions will fall between 0.3% and 1.2% this year. Using higher and lower forecasts for global GDP growth from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. A few days later, the Breakthrough Institute, a research center in California, predicted emissions will decline 0.5 to 2.2%, basing its calculations on growth forecasts from JP Morgan and assuming the global economy recovers in the second half.
It's a short-term, okay, at least there's something improving. If you're asthmatic, it's much nicer to go for a run right now. It's not going to last that long. So as soon as everybody gets back to normal, these emissions are going to start, unless we decide to do something different.
Some foresee a bigger hit to the economy. The London-based Centre for Economics and Business Research estimates that world GDP will fall by at least 4% this year, albeit with a huge margin of error. That drop will be more than twice as large as the contraction during the financial crisis, and the largest annual fall in GDP since 1931, barring wartime. With governments launching gigantic stimulus packages to stop the economies collapsing, investors are now watching to see how far the United States and China, the European Union, Japan, and others embrace lower emissions energy sources. Meanwhile, experts have said there are, to a certain degree, parallels that can be drawn between the current COVID-19 pandemic and some of other contemporary crises our world is facing, all requiring a global to local response and long-term thinking. All need to be guided by science and need to protect the most vulnerable among us. And all require the political will to take fundamental changes when faced with existential risks. Officials of the World Health Organization are reporting devastating consequences of underprepared health systems when they are faced with these increasingly regular shocks. Some of these health impacts have a clear climate change signature, such as the increasing frequency and strength of extreme weather events, or the expanding range and spread of vector-borne diseases like malaria or dengue. For others, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the connection with climate change is less clear-cut.
When we think about the COVID-19, the best healthcare systems in the world are struggling to deal with these pandemics. So it is difficult to imagine how the healthcare system that was undermined and weakened by the over 10 years of armed conflict would be able to cope with this situation.
There is one thing, however, that almost all health shocks have in common. They hit the poorest and the most vulnerable the hardest. They act as poverty multipliers, forcing families into extreme poverty because they have to pay for health care. At least half of the world's population does not enjoy full coverage for the most basic health services.
Just like everybody else, we are very worried and concerned with what may happen if the pandemic reaches some of the most vulnerable communities that we are helping. So, for example, people who live in the camps for the displaced or detainees in prisons. So all these areas where we work, where people live in very confined environments, and where the access to water and hygiene items is challenging.
When health disasters hit, and in a business-as-usual scenario, they will do so increasingly, global inequality is sustained and reinforced and paid for with the lives of the poor and marginalized. Food insecurity levels in the Sahel region are spiraling out of control. That's according to the World Food Programme, as it expressed concerns about the potential impact of humanitarian supply chains because of restrictions imposed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Across the central Sahel in Africa, encompassing Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, more than 5 million people face severe food insecurity ahead of the coming lean season.
Burkina Faso is now, if not the first, at least one of the most or the fastest growing displaced population crisis in the world. It's a country that virtually had no IDPs, internally displaced populations, 18 months ago. And now the latest official figures are in excess of 800,000 people displaced.
Humanitarians have repeatedly warned that chronic insecurity linked to successive droughts and violent extremists who exploit the lack of a strong state presence have created an avoidable crisis, which WFP said has now extended to the coastal countries of Sierra Leone and Liberia. Forecasts indicate that Burkina Faso will see food insecurity more than triple to more than 2.1 million people in June. The number of people going hungry is also expected to rise in Mali, with 1.3 million people vulnerable, along with 2 million people in Niger.
For the lean season, the upcoming months, June to September, the analysis concluded that we are going from 10.8 million people declared food insecure last year, 2019, to 19.1 million people in 2020. This is an increase of 77% from last year, and it's unprecedented.
Although WFP has access across the Sahel to populations in need, the agency is extremely concerned about the impact of the new coronavirus on a region with one of the weakest healthcare systems in the world. If it emerges in a similar way to much of the rest of the world, it will lead to a serious deterioration in people's resilience as markets and borders close, preventing herders from moving their animals to fresh pasture.
We need to limit the number of people that gather, so we need to fragment the number of sites of distribution. The maximum numbers vary from one country to the other, but in general, not more than 50 people can be gathered. And even when those people can be gathered, we are implementing standard operating procedures to minimize the transmission of the disease. So there's a temperature check for all people coming into the distribution sites. And we have to respect 1 meter between every individual coming to get the food assistance.
At a wider logistical level, the United Nations agency is also exploring all options to ensure that vital aid supply lines can withstand the expected disruption of COVID-19.
Some of the bigger companies, and indeed the main suppliers globally, are in countries that are currently under strict confinement and a very reduced level of production. A lot of the nutritious products are produced in India or France, for example, where factories have had to reduce or close or reduce significantly their production. We have big concerns on this, and our supply chain colleagues, together with UNICEF, are looking at locally available enriched foods to complement this.
In a dark ground floor room in Lagos, dressmaker Kemi Adepoju, a mother of two who runs her business from a room she rents in Iwaya suburb of Lagos, dusts a pile of dresses she has made, but which cannot be collected due to the lockdown enforced to slow the spread of the new coronavirus. Like millions in Africa, Kemi works in the informal sector, which accounts for more than 85% of unemployment across the continent, and would be largely bypassed by mega economic support measures that cash-strapped governments are rolling out. The International Monetary Fund said in a blog on the outbreak's impact on Africa last month that social distancing was not realistic for the most vulnerable, and the notion of working from home was only possible for the few.
The government should help us to end this so that people can have their parties. It is only when people organize parties that we can get money to eat. We have nothing to sell. We are tailors. Government should help us.
Glamorous party scenes are a must-see in Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy, often keeping tailors like Kemi always busy. But lockdowns, initially slated to last 14 days, began in Lagos and the capital Abuja on the 30th of March, meant no one was organizing parties and so not making new dresses or even picking those already given to tailors. The federal government has announced a prepayment moratorium for government loans made to small businesses ranging from market traders to farmers, and has said it will offer similar relief to large companies. The government says it has begun making cash transfers to the country's poorest households, but many hawkers and other informal traders do not have bank or mobile money accounts to pay into, even if they were eligible. But Bilikisu Tijani, who is not interested in the cash transfers because she believes it will not get to her, says people coming to buy food on credit if the lockdown continues is her greatest fear.
If the lockdown should take longer than it's supposed to, people won't have money to purchase food again. So everything they'll be taking will be on credit, and it will affect us a lot. So my prayer is that the coronavirus, like the COVID-19, should just come to an end before the 2 weeks break that has been given to everybody, so that everybody will go back to their normal life and work as they used to.
Meanwhile, Kemi still continues to sew the fabrics already received with hope that the lockdown will end and lives will return to normal.
This lockdown was so sudden. If we saw it coming, I would not have used all the money to buy fabric. I would have kept the money and used it to buy food now.
The coronavirus crisis has piled more pressure on the government's finances at a time when it was already struggling with a slump in the price of oil, the mainstay of the economy. Meanwhile, the World Food Programme said it is vital that at this time of global crisis, humanitarian agencies and governments maintain food assistance programs which offer a lifeline to 87 million vulnerable people around the world. WFP said it is leading global logistics in support of health and humanitarian responders around the world as they scramble to curb the spread of the virus and mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
At the World Food Program, we're assisting 85 to 95 million people throughout the year. Whether it's war zones or climate extremes or just poverty-stricken areas, we're there helping people, changing lives and saving lives. Now that we have a pandemic, it makes our work that much more critical. In fact, if we lose our funding or lose access, we can see 150,000 people could lose their lives on a daily basis over many months. This is why our operations must continue. They're critical, whether it's supply chain, emergency operations for food, delivering emergency medical supplies for WHO or UNICEF throughout the world. We're there, cooperating, working with nations and leaders to save lives and change lives.
The program said it is establishing humanitarian hubs and regional staging areas to facilitate the dispatch of essential cargo, setting up air transport lanes, contracting charter vessels where shipping has been disrupted, and providing passenger air and medevac services for humanitarian staff. These will be built on WFP's global network of strategically placed humanitarian responders depot and will provide the logistics backbone for global effort.
It is a combination, on one hand, of a disease that represents a threat to everybody in the world, and second, because it has an economic impact that will bring a recession that probably has no parallel in the recent past. the combination of the two facts and the risk that it contributes to enhance instability, enhance unrest, and enhanced conflict are things that make us believe that this is indeed the most challenging crisis we have faced since the Second World War, and the one that needs a stronger and more effective response that is only possible in solidarity if everybody come together and if we forget political games and understand that it is humankind that is at stake.
WFP said the pandemic is affecting countries in different ways, adding that it is providing real-time tracking of changes in the areas of food security, health access and markets in vulnerable countries. Data and analysis are visualized through web-based platforms such as the Hunger Map Live.
So our major challenge now, all the area, all the routes are blocked and the access are really limited, and we are trying to prepare ourselves to help to avoid the corona spread, specifically the IDPs living in the IDP camps or the vulnerable population in living in rural area.
Monitoring will be complemented with early warning and security analysis of how the pandemic is impacting food and other vulnerabilities.
At the beginning, when the armed men raided our village, it was to steal our cattle and poultry. When they started killing people, men fled the village and they were later followed by women. When we reached Kelbo, they were killing people there too, so we had to flee again. Our habits have changed because of the disease COVID-19. Now we wash our hands more regularly with soap before eating or drinking water. We strictly follow the sanitary rules that they taught us to avoid the spread of the virus.
On the 25th of March, the United Nations Office Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs launched the Global Interagency COVID-19 Response Plan, featuring an appeal for $2 billion to help the world's poorest and the most vulnerable people.
The message of the report we are issuing today is clear. Share the responsibility and global solidarity in response to the impacts of COVID-19. It is a call to action.
WFP's requirement, as outlined in plan, is $350 million. This is needed to fund common humanitarian services, including vital aviation, shipping, storage and transport, as well as engineering services in areas affected by the pandemic. The United Nations Office Coordinating Humanitarian Affairs appeal is additional to the World Food Programme's existing plans to provide food assistance to 87 million people in 2020.
It is essential that developed countries immediately assist those less developed to bolster their health systems and their response capacity to stop transmission. Otherwise, we face the nightmare of the disease spreading like wildfire in the global south, with millions of deaths and the prospect of the disease re-emerging where it was previously suppressed. Let us remember that we are only as strong as the weakest health system in our interconnected world. I am particularly concerned with the African continent, and I strongly encourage the G20 to move ahead with the G20 Africa initiative as proposed at the summit.
The World Food Programme has separately asked donors to expedite an estimated $1.9 billion in already pledged but not yet received contributions so that forward procurement and pre-positioning of 3 months' worth of buffer stocks can be accelerated. That's our show for the week. Be sure to join us next week for another episode of the program. And you can send your comments and questions to us. edfile@channelstv.com is our email address. Check us out on youtube.com/channelsweb. Do click the playlist menu and then click Edfile. From me, Ayola Kasim, and the crew here in Lagos, it's bye for now.